beaches or our 16,000 acres.
Okay, we've got a lot of legislation to talk about and sign today. Welcome, everyone, for these hearings. Before we start out, we're going to be talking about different council members connected to different pieces of legislation, but one is here out of the goodness of his heart because he likes all the legislation. Councilmember Mark Weprin, we want to welcome you. And first, we're going to talk about intros 519A and 562A, which build on work we've done to ensure that New York City stays safe and resilient during and after emergencies. This bill is sponsored by Councilmember Mark Traeger. This is your first bill, is that right?
That's correct.
Congratulations. Councilmember Traeger is chair of the Committee on Recovery and Resiliency. Intro 519A requires OEM to distribute emergency preparedness materials to communities at risk during coastal storms or hurricanes. It includes information on local evacuation zones and resources. Intro 562A creates Hurricane Sandy, a charitable, let me get this right, a task force related to charitable organizations and houses of worship that are involved in the recovery effort. After Sandy, charities and houses of worship supplemented city, state, and federal recovery operations. They offered supplies, medical care, other services. Often were the first to get to there to help their neighbors and folks in communities. Many people, many communities still recovering from the damage, but they haven't been reimbursed for efforts. As a city, we must honor all those who helped their fellow New Yorkers, and the task force will make recommendations on how to streamline the allocation of resources and support. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in the process leading to this day when we'll sign the legislation. I want to thank some folks who couldn't be with us, our OEM Commissioner Joe Esposito, and of course our Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito. And now I will introduce Bill Goldstein, my Senior Advisor for Recovery, Resiliency, and Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll speak to the second bill. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, houses of worship and not-for-profit organizations served a critical role in the early response and recovery efforts. In some of the hardest-hit neighborhoods, these organizations provided shelter, resources, distributed food and other basic supplies, and provided social services. Much of this help has continued throughout the long-term recovery effort. By enacting this law, the city will work with local nonprofits to formalize our lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy, identify barriers to assisting nonprofits in the event of future disasters, and create new ways for nonprofits and houses of worship to become part of the city's preparation and resiliency planning efforts going forward. Working together in this way, we can help build the city's capacity to respond during future disasters. After all, resiliency in the face of future disasters will come not just from top-down actions and investments, but from grassroots collaboration as well. So I want to thank Councilman Traeger for sponsoring this legislation.
Thank you very much, Bill. And now the man of the hour. Hold on. Councilman Mark Traeger.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In my district, I don't need this stepping stool, but here I guess I do. First of all, I want to thank Mayor de Blasio and really his outstanding Sandy team, Bill Goldstein. I know Amy Peterson is not here, but they've been really, really helpful, cooperative, and very responsive. We thank them. We're taking important steps today to continue the long recovery from Sandy and to take steps to prepare our city and the public for the next major storm or emergency with two pieces of legislation that I'm proud to have sponsored. I want to quickly thank again Mayor de Blasio, his administration, Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito for their continued leadership, Laura Popa, Jeff Baker, Brad Reed, who's here with us, did great work, Bill Murray and Ethan Lustig-Grably from my staff for their hard work on moving this legislation, and members of the Committee on Recovery and Resiliency, and the entire Council for their continued devotion to the New Yorkers impacted by Sandy. As we continue the recovery from Sandy, it's imperative we don't forget about the many charitable organizations and houses of worship that were there before anyone else in the critical seconds and days, hours and days right after the storm hit our city. It is also vital that we learn from this experience and find ways to better connect residents in vulnerable communities with information and resources that is specific to their neighborhood. Intro 519 requires that pamphlets and other materials distributed by the Office of Emergency Management are tailored to vulnerable communities and include specific details on local organizations, evacuation zones and centers, and other information that residents need during a storm or emergency. These materials, also very key, would be translated in the 10 most commonly spoken languages within each of the targeted communities so that as many residents as possible have access to this vital information. That is a key part of the bill. Intro 562, which I think really is historic for our city, creates a task force to review the role that houses of worship and charitable groups played in the aftermath of Sandy and examine ways for government to reimburse these groups for expenses incurred while helping residents recover. Again, they were there before anyone else was there, and it's critical that we have houses of worship and charitable groups serve on this task force to hear directly from them and to have this task force get input so we can be better prepared for our city moving forward. Again, these two pieces of legislation will help accomplish many goals for storm preparedness and better prepare us for any types of emergency. My thanks again to Mayor de Blasio, the Speaker, and everyone here on getting these major bills passed and accomplished. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. And now we have time for public testimony. We have one person signed up, Joe Rosenberg, Catholic Community Relations Council. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon. I'm Joe Rosenberg, Director of the Catholic Community Relations Council, and I represent the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Brooklyn. I'm pleased to be here in support of Intro 562A, which establishes the Hurricane Sandy Charitable Organization and House of Worship Recovery Task Force. When Sandy hit the New York City area, religious organizations and houses of worship provided food, shelter, and relief to thousands of displaced and desperate residents of our city's shorefront communities. These institutions were the first responders and in many instances provided the space and facilities to allow for subsequent federal, state, and city relief efforts. Despite suffering catastrophic damage, these houses of worship continued to open their doors to serve as food pantries and places of shelter for people who lost everything overnight. Although Sandy struck New York over 2.5 years ago, the pain of loss of life and loss of shelter lingers. Not only were the homes of countless of shorefront residents damaged or destroyed, but over 120 Catholic churches throughout the 5 boroughs of the city were badly damaged, and many of them declared ineligible for receiving FEMA assistance to help with rebuilding efforts. We strongly support this initiative. However, the amended bill eliminates the specific reference to houses of worship and clergy being represented on the task force and replaces those terms with a broader term of charitable organizations. We believe it is important to ensure that the religious organizations and clergy that responded to Hurricane Sandy serve as members of this task force. Reducing or eliminating the presence of religious organizations appears not only counterintuitive to the express purpose of this legislation, but also sends a troubling message that diminishes the voice of the clergy that gave so much of themselves during Hurricane Sandy and its devastating aftermath. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. And now let's sign the legislation. Okay. But wait, there's more. Intros 384A and 655. These will help ensure transparency in city finances. Intro 384A requires the Parks Department to report contributions from conservancies and other non-governmental entities to city parks, sponsored by Mark Levine, council member and chair of the Committee on Parks and Recreation, and also by council member Brad Lander. This will provide us all with a better understanding of the Conservancy's role in helping the Parks Department to care for parks throughout the city. We'll also be signing today Intro 655, which makes technical adjustments to legislation I signed earlier this year that reauthorizes the city to sell tax liens. This is sponsored by Councilmember Jalissa Ferreras, chair of the Committee on Finance. I want to thank a number of people who helped us to put these two pieces of legislation together. Mitch Silver, our Parks Commissioner, Dean Foulahan, our OMB Director, our Finance Commissioner, Jacques Jiha, our DEP Commissioner, Emily Lloyd, and of course, Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito. And with that, it is my honor to introduce Councilmember and sponsor, Mark Levine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for being such a strong voice in favor of parks equity over the years. And as mayor, I want to be clear that we really are grateful for all the work that activists and volunteers and donors have put in to build conservancies in some of our city's most famous parks. We're really grateful. But we also acknowledge at the same time that there are hundreds of parks in low and moderate income neighborhoods around the 5 boroughs that don't have the benefit of private revenue. And that has left an enormous gap. That's the parks equity gap between what we're seeing in these neighborhoods and what we see in the privately funded parks. And the challenge at even beginning to address that gap is that we don't know how big it is. And today is an important step forward in getting that information, so we'll understand exactly how much money is coming in to these private conservancies. As the mayor knows, this is actually the second time that our local government has tried to tackle this issue. When you were in the council in 2008, you passed what became Local Law 48. The prior administration adhered to some, what I would call hyper-technical compliance and ultimately spit out nonsensical numbers. And so today we've got a really strong, robust piece of legislation that'll make sure that every New Yorker knows in a uniform way on the timetable of the city's fiscal year just how much private money is going into the biggest parks conservancies. So I want to thank you for your support. Thank you for the Community Parks Initiative and your other important efforts to address the equity gap. And I want to thank the people who worked hard on this bill, including my Chief of Staff, Aya Keefe, my Legislative Director, Amy Slattery, our amazing parks staff, Chris Sartori and Patrick Mulvihill, Chima Obichair, as well as the central legislative staff of the council, Matt Gawal, Laura Papa, the Speaker of the City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, my partner in this effort, Councilmember Brad Lander. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Councilmember. You've been a great voice for parks equity, and you've certainly helped us to move that agenda forward in a lot of ways. I want to thank you for that. All right, do we have any public testimony? We do not have any public testimony. I am flipping the page, and that means now we can sign these pieces of legislation. Okay, last but not least, intro 615A allows the Taxi and Limousine Commission to update requirements for trouble lights in licensed vehicles, sponsored by Councilmember Idanis Rodriguez, Chair of the Committee on Transportation. The trouble light on the front and back of taxis and liveries sends distress signals to law enforcement in the event of criminal activity. Currently, taxis are using outdated technology. This bill allows the TLC to consider newer and better technologies that are more visible to police passing by, and it will help to keep our drivers safe. Again, want to thank Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito for her support, and now want to introduce one of the hardest working women in government, the never controversial Taxi and Limousine Commission, TLC Chair Meera Joshi.
Thank you. First, I want to thank. Thank you.
There you go.
I want to thank our partners in this endeavor, Chair Rodriguez and Chair Vanessa Gibson, for listening and supporting the second driver protection initiative undertaken by Council in the last few months and moving it through the legislative process so quickly. It's an easy legislative change that will make a great improvement in the lives and safety of our drivers. Prior to today, the administrative code limited trouble lights or distress signals to one defined lollipop light, about a 4-inch circular orange light that appears on the front and back of the car. Very few people on the street know what it is, and I'm not sure that all law enforcement knows exactly what it is when it's on. But thanks to Council, tomorrow's vehicle owners will have an actual, efficient, effective distress signal. I want to also thank Commissioner Bratton, who has already reached out to me and my staff with ideas on specifications for the most efficient, for law enforcement, and most cost-efficient distress signal that we can now have mandated for all TLC vehicles. 2014 was a year of way too many assaults on drivers, including 2 tragic deaths of drivers after carjacking. And just this week, a taxi driver was held at knife point Monday afternoon near 8th Avenue. Luckily, a nearby Port Authority officer saw that the driver was in distress and stopped the vehicle. Going forward, drivers will have a new defense against assault: bright, recognizable trouble lights that can take meaningful minutes off of law enforcement response time and can prevent or curtail assaults against drivers. So thank you very much, Council, for this meaningful legislation.
All right, thank you. Now it's my pleasure to welcome the Chair of Transportation Committee, who has made driver safety a real priority, and we appreciate his efforts, Council Member Idanis Rodriguez. Thank you, brother.
Let me get my glasses, when you turn 50, you need glasses.
There you go.
First of all, thank you, our mayor, the great leader in our city. It's Intro 615. It will make a much-needed technical changes to the administrative code that will have broad implications for increasing the safety of drivers. Trouble lights indicating when a licensed driver is in a distress to police, have become outdated and of a little use of our drivers. Technology like this wouldn't be possible under the current code, and I look forward to working with the administration to determine the best method for continue protecting our drivers. Right now, a licensed driver is 25 times more likely to be assaulted while on the job than the average workers. My colleague at the council and I are dedicated to increasing the safety of our drivers, and today we take another step forward toward that goal. Thanks our Speaker, Melissa Viverito, for the speedy passage of this legislation, and Mayor Bill de Blasio for enacting it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any public testimony? No, I'm just going to do a little summary then on all the pieces of legislation in Spanish before we sign this one. Hoy firmamos 5 leyes que harán a la ciudad más justa, segura y transparente. Entre las nuevas leyes, una crea una comisión para identificar maneras de apoyar a los grupos comunitarios que ayudaron a neoyorquinos después del huracán Sandy. Otra hace que el Departamento de Parques reporte los fondos privados de los parques de la ciudad. With that, let us sign the final piece of legislation.